Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at medcomsnetworking.com. So information, services, resources, activities for people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and so on, the global medcoms community, basically. We do a lot of these sorts of webinars and capture a lot of video content. You'll find more than 500 videos now over at Network Pharma TV. So it's really quite a big useful resource over there if you haven't seen it already, covering all manner of topics around medcoms. I also do a lot to encourage people to come and get a job in medcoms, and at firstmedcomsjob.com you'll find lots of information, resources, signposts, careers guides, and so on, hopefully helping you get a job as a medical writer, account manager, or whatever. So today, one of the fun things about these webinars that we run is we can get people from all over the world talking to us about all sorts of stuff. And we've got a great international audience again today. So thank you to those for joining us. But I've got three great panelists who are now going to introduce themselves. We are just going to have a panel discussion today. We're talking about medical society conferences and putting Len a little bit on the spot, because a year ago, Len was making some predictions about what was going to happen. And we've been talking, I think, every year now, Len, for the last 3 years, about what is happening with conferences because of the whole pandemic and stuff. So anyway, we thought we'd continue the tradition, meet again today. Great to have Ilan and April with us from GMED. And just review what's going on out there. Anybody in the audience who can share any insights, we would be really, really happy to get them, okay? So Len, no further ado, over to you. Introduce yourself and set the scene. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I'm a digital, well, I call myself a digital healthcare consultant, but relevant for what we're going to be discussing today. I've been following medical society conferences for about 15 years. Lots of reasons for that, but I haven't really stopped, and I realized that the whole topic of medical society conferences is an interesting one, and particularly over the last few years, obviously with the impact of COVID. So I'm picking up now from really the presentation I gave almost a year ago here on this platform, and really, at the beginning of the year, I wanted to notice how well hybrid medical conferences have performed in 22, and particularly from a doctor's acceptance perspective. So I started to dig deep, or at least I tried to, but it soon emerged there was good news and there was bad news. And the good news is that doctors have indeed embraced hybrid events. The predicted, virtual attendee participation ranges have been confirmed, and earlier polls and surveys were amazingly spot on. The bad news, which was astonishing for me, is that many, and perhaps the majority of medical societies, don't want you to know this. They refuse to share their attendee data. Yeah, think about that. So let me elaborate on the good news. The surveys conducted in Europe and the US in 20 and 21 predicted a range of virtual participation preferences between, with a few assumptions, between 20 and 30%. Based on my research into well over a dozen medical society conferences staged in 22, the range, in fact, was 19 to 35%. Now, I'm not presenting this range as being statistically significant, even if that's actually possible right now, far more as being, well, business relevant. So here are a few examples from societies that I'm very familiar with. ESHRE, 19% online, 81% in person. ESMO, 20%, 80%. ASCO, 31%, 69%. The ESC, 34%, 66%. That's an unofficial number, but accurate. And the EHA, the European Hematology Association, a whopping 35% online, 65% in person. It's worth noting that the two societies with the lowest online participation, ESHRE and ESMO, were also societies that didn't offer a discount for online participation. In polls from 21, doctors had clearly expressed a desire for moderate online participation fees. It was about $150 or so. So by the way, the discounts on online participation was enormous, from 78% to ESHRE and ESMO's 0%. One more statistic that's worth noting is that totals of all registered participants remained at levels similar to those seen prior to 2020 at in-person only events. But the caveat, as always, and Peter always reminds me of this, is that registrations and attendees are not the same thing. Now, to put all of that into perspective, just a few days ago, GMED released the results of a global survey of doctors, which showed that 41% preferred physical, 24% virtual, and 35% hybrid. And I think these stats will be discussed later. So what business relevant conclusions can we draw from these findings? Well, as stated, hybrid conferences didn't increase overall attendee numbers, but instead enticed a significant percentage of doctors to attend online. And this is going to be the new normal, I'm sure. It also confirmed that doctors want a choice of participation options. The much cited pros of attending online, not being away from home, no travel, global access, reduced costs, better educational experiences, still hold. I can't really say anything about the impact of hybrid on more opportunities for patient inclusion. It's a pity. This aspect clearly needs further research, but the only feedback I've had from patient organizations indicate that the impact has been zero or minimal. Professional conference organizers and conference platform providers have been on a bit of a roller coaster. Remember, from staging in-person events in 2019, virtual in 2020 and 21, and last year to hybrid. Many now ask what's next, but observe with concern that societies have started to bring virtual platform expertise in-house, something they didn't have prior to COVID. The term hybrid was used less frequently and continues to be used less frequently, having been replaced by on-site and online or similar. Some PCOs have even described the term as being poisonous. From what I observed, there was little evidence of the much discussed and anticipated interaction between in-person and online attendees. But bear in mind that online attendance, I believe for many, may well mean simply viewing presentations on demand post-event. The need for this interaction may well have been exaggerated. Finally, it must be clear to the pharma industry, or it must be clear now, that the new normal in medical conferences are here to stay, and I think requiring a fundamental reassessment of participation strategies. I've spoken about this great deal in the past, but it's worth remembering that in one survey of over 200 pharmas and medtechs in 21, 70% stated they would invest on-site versus 30% online at hybrid events. I mean, that's a significant shift. It's also worth noting that the shift to online is a clear adjunct to pharma's current love affair, say that, with so-called omni-channel marketing. So now let's focus on the bad news. As I mentioned earlier, I was astonished that perhaps the majority of medical societies refuse to share their attendee data. Now, in the past, many societies posted highly detailed conference stats on their websites, but these appear to have vanished, at least for non-members such as myself. Multiple requests to society press offices were routinely ignored, in most cases without even a courtesy acknowledgement of receipt. So let me give you 3 examples. I'm going to name and shame. The European Society of Cardiology. Now, in August 22, the Society's program chairman, committee chair, Stefan Aschenbach, stated that we're convinced that a hybrid meeting is going to be the new standard for medical meetings and for the ESC. They refuse to share their data. The European Academy of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. This society conducted a survey of members showing that 83% preferred hybrid formats. They were one of the first to do this. They've now held 2 hybrid annual conferences in 21 and 22, but they too refuse to share the data. Finally, ECTRIMS, the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis. They state that they believe in the hybrid model. But instead of simply providing the data, the ECTRIMS executive manager requested the following information. Get this: visitor statistics from websites on which the attendee data would be posted. The purpose of requesting the data in the first place. And if I provided the information, then stated it would weigh up the pros and cons. I mean, can you believe that? Needless to say, I gave up in disgust. So why are societies refusing to share the data? I mean, it seems inconceivable that they're not sharing the data with their own members. I mean, digitally savvy younger members would be up in arms. Likewise, it seems inconceivable that societies would not share with commercial partners, such as farmers, wishing to participate at annual conferences. I mean, their investment decisions would be dependent on knowing the on-site versus online attendee split. Inevitably, I mean, it seems to me that this attendee data will leak out somehow and become common knowledge. Hence, attempts by societies to conceal data seem patently futile. So what's driving societies to conceal their data? Well, many simply want and hope for a return to predominantly in-person conferences. Hybrid formats threaten their well-established business models. And I've spoken to many of my colleagues in digital healthcare, and that seems to be the collective wisdom right now. Societies are also concerned, perhaps legitimately, with the complexity and cost of staging hybrid events. It seems that not disclosing data is one of the tactics they've adopted in an effort to push attendees back to attending in person. Arguably, they also pushed and continue to push FOMO, fear of missing out, by extolling the attractions of event venues, wonderful Barcelona, stressing the considerable advantage of attending in person, meeting people, interactions, great dinners, and in some cases, by providing attendees with a clear conscience regarding their carbon footprints. In 2022, the ESC in Barcelona declared that it had offset the carbon footprint of all of its activities and proclaimed to the in-person attendees, your stay in Barcelona is carbon neutral. Now, some of you may be aware, carbon offsetting is highly controversial. Many call it greenwashing, with some leading climatologists describing it as actively dangerous. Well, regardless of what you believe about offsetting, the ESC could be accused of being disingenuous. I mean, it appears to me that the ESC is using offsetting as an overt tactic to eliminate an obstacle that may prevent attendees from participating in person. But it may well backfire. EMA just released the results of a survey showing that 67% of doctors don't want societies to offset, with only 25% saying that they do. However, in the same survey, and to put that into perspective, it showed that only 50% of doctors said that environmental considerations would influence their decision to attend conferences virtually. 39% said that they would. So, in conclusion, I must say I was disappointed not to be able to gather more insights. If medical societies are reluctant to share data, clearly we need to exploit other sources such as medical journals, healthcare market research organizations, doctors' social networks, PCOs, academia, and patient organizations. I mean, I've used all of these extensively in the past to get the big picture, and particularly the presentations here on MedComms in the last few years. But I did use one other source, ChatGPT. Not chat for, ChatGPT. I asked a number of questions, one of which was, what format will medical conferences use in future? The answer was immediate, about 2 pages long, and frighteningly accurate, coherent, and well established. Although I didn't learn anything really new, it addressed all the right issues. I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay.
Len, you can ask
ChatGPT
ChatGPT to shorten it for you.
Yeah. Okay. And we don't want to go too far down the ChatGPT line here, but it's interesting to throw these sorts of ideas around. Len, I find it fascinating. I've moaned many times in the past about the lack of data sharing. You know, how do we all know what's going on? How can we learn if we don't talk to each other? I find it a real shame that people are so secretive. And as you say, it's interesting to contrast what happens these days versus a few years ago, when they'd very happily tell you how many thousands or tens of thousands of people were at the conference and where they came from. Now it's, despite the fact that now you can measure everything, you get less data. I find that absolutely fascinating, but there may be a number of reasons for it, and it may be interesting to discuss those. Again, just saying to the audience, if you have any insights or any information, or if you'd like to basically give us the answer to some of Len's questions, do use the text boxes to share that, and we can bring it into the conversation. Ilan, over to you at GMed. So introduce yourself, tell us what you're up to. Len's talked about a couple of the studies you've been doing. Talk a bit about what you're seeing from your point of view. Over to you.
Okay, great to be here again and discuss this important topic. I'm Ilan. I'm from GMed. I'm the CEO of GMed. GMed is a global social network for verified physicians only. Over 1.5 million physicians across almost 200 countries. And we monitor daily what physicians are saying, what are discussing from firsthand. And one of the topics, of course, is the conferences. We also ask them sometimes some questions about their medical conferences preferences. And Len did describe that or mention that in earlier, but during 2020, we asked physicians which type of medical conference format do they prefer. And results, and then we ask again the same question about 2 or 3 weeks ago. We got over 400 poll votes and also some comments. And what amazing is also what Len was talking about. Physicians do prefer physical settings. We've seen that 2 years ago. We see that now. Actually, the portion of physicians preferring physical settings remain the same on the same percentage almost, which is amazing. But then we saw 2 other portions of hybrid and virtual simply switching places. So today, physicians prefer more hybrid versus the time of COVID that was storming at that time. So actually all of that really makes sense. If you look at that, and also when analyzing the discussions, physicians prefer physical, no doubt. They want to shake hands, they want to speak, they want to be able to meet their colleagues, and to talk with them not only about lectures, right? Also to make some networking. And during COVID, obviously, there wasn't any physical aspect. So physicians prefer the virtual side. But now it's switched between the virtual and the hybrid simply because COVID taught the physicians that they can meet virtually, but they can do that also while maybe doing some physical aspects. So this is why the hybrid is now a bit more. Again, overall, we think that COVID taught us that there are ways to collaborate, but still some challenges that we can talk about it later on. For example, how physicians still want to be engaged with each other, even if they are not meeting physically. And what are the importance of discussing conference material in a prolonged manner and not only on the conference itself.
So thanks, Ilan. Can I just clarify at this stage, or just be a little bit careful how we're talking about this? And I accept the fact that some of what we're talking about is a bit of a simplistic view anyway. So there's all sorts of nuance and all the rest of it. But just to be clear, the data that you've just produced, and just to reinforce that, both you and Len have talked about it. This is data that I think you got last week or something. So I mean, it's up to date data. 400 doctors. What do you refer? It's not so strictly speaking. The numbers were 40-odd%. 41% of people prefer physical, which isn't the majority. It's just the biggest category. And then what was it? I'm just trying to. I should have had this in my head.
20, almost 25%. Yeah, almost 25% preferred virtual, and 35% prefer hybrid.
For hybrid, yeah. And, okay. So yeah. I think my point is, it's not. If you take those figures at face value, that's not the majority preferring physical. It's actually, if anything, the clear message is people like the choice. And the worrying thing from the point of view of organizing a meeting is, in an ideal world, it probably reflects the fact that most people would prefer physical, but they want the choice. And we don't live in an ideal world. And what we've learned over the last couple of years is that actually we can do a lot online. So if we have got patients to look after, or we've got the dog to look after, or we've got the kids to look after, or the wife has, in my case, given me a long list of things I'm supposed to do this week, it's like, well, actually I can do a lot, and therefore I will take that option. Is that fair? Because I think it's an important point to distinguish between that sort of, and I accept the fact that I would say I'm much happier meeting people. I'd much rather this meeting was in person. It would just be impossible to do. So the fact that we can have a really useful meeting like this online is hugely useful to lots of people. But I would never answer a question, if somebody said to me, what would you prefer, doing it like this or in person? I'd probably go, well, in person, except that's impossible. Am I being fair there? Because it's not, I think it's important to understand the nuance there.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Eventually, everybody wants to have a way to choose, right? But one thing that needs to be pointed out, it's the fact that even though the physical percentage was 42 or something, it's not the majority. I mean, it's not over 50, but it's still the largest group. Yeah. And if you take into consideration that hybrid was 35%, hybrid it also has a portion of physical. So let's even suppose, and we still, coming back to the podcast we did a year ago, nobody really knows what's hybrid. I mean, it can be a lot of things. So let's assume just 10% out of the hybrid is physical. You see you're crossing to the 50 and up.
Okay.
So knowing physician, yeah.
Okay, I get that, but then the other thing I'm going to say, and to Len's point earlier on, the sort of thing I always pick up people in this conversation is what's happening to the economics. Yeah, if let's take even that sort of more than 50% of people want to go physically, but we're clearly showing 30+% of people, and Len's figures are clearly reinforcing 30% of people aren't turning up. What does that do to the economics? What does that do to the funding? If half the people want to go to that meeting, but half, or let's say 60% want to go to the meeting and 40% don't, that could severely affect the on-site offering, let alone anything else, and affect the funding and so on. And it's that stack of cards that is at risk here, isn't it? Sorry, I need to get that point in because I think it's really important, and nobody ever answers those sorts of problems. But Len, you were trying to say something. Sorry, I was cutting across.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of my short intro, I mean, I cited a range of participation preferences between 20 and 30%. And the questions that the surveys that were conducted in 20 and 21 were asking the same questions essentially that Ilan had posted about preferences. So if you make some assumptions about how many of those preferring hybrid would actually opt for physical or opt for virtual, that's how you get the range. I mean, because we only ask those questions. And what my research, I think, has shown is that range is valid. So it's right. I think all the points you've made are correct, but that's how we've got to this range.
Okay, and Len, just talk to the camera a little bit because we lose you when you talk off to one side. Okay, sorry. But I think we're all sort of agreeing with each other that the argument is it becomes quite individual around a particular society, a particular audience, a particular set of agendas, and all the rest of it. I just really think it's important that people sort of think about it properly, rather than maybe just take some of the headline figures that get bandied around. And as I say, economically, the success of a conference can be made on that last 10, let alone 20, 30% of people that turn up. You know, that's when you tip over and you start making some money. So I just think it's really, really important. April, sorry, and April,
yes.
bring you in, but also you wanted to talk about it. I'm quite interested in what you wanted to talk about the sort of half-life education stuff. But April,
Yeah.
go on, go.
Thank you, Peter. So hi, my name's April Chan. I'm the medical advisor at GMed, and I'm also a physician from the UK as well. So first of all, I just want to add on to this point, Peter, about choice and the economics of it all. So I think it's very important to remember that there are audiences that traditional conferences, in-person physical conferences, don't reach. And that could be remote physicians. Okay, so you know, physicians that can't travel for whatever reason. And nowadays, of course, we know there's a shortage of doctors. So it's almost not ethical to ask these remote physicians to take large chunks of their time to turn up to physical conferences. And second of all, physicians from developing nations, which have a lot to offer, would gain a lot from the information that is being distributed in those medical conferences to bring back to their home countries. And you know, these two audiences could easily be targeted through the hybrid model. I think there was a paper written a couple of years ago that said that there was actually a 10-fold increase in terms of interactive participation and engagement at conferences when they were done online rather than physical, because as we know, in online conferences, you have the extra Q&A element to it. And so, you know, in terms of doctors that might not necessarily speak the language, you know, that the conference is being conducted in, you know, who would traditionally have to wear a headset or something like that, could easily translate their questions through the online platform, through Google Translate or whatever. We see this at GMed quite a lot, where physicians from all over the world prefer actually asking questions in their own language. And so moving on to the point about medical education. So of course I'm a physician, and when I went to medical school all those years ago, one thing that was quite commonly said was the fact that actually by the end of medical school, half of the medical knowledge that you've learned from medical school has expired, has become obsolete, has become irrelevant. And so actually there was a paper written a couple of years ago that estimated that half-life of medical knowledge, this was back I think in 2017, expires between 18 to 24 months. And there was a prediction that by 2020, this half-life of medical knowledge would be 73 days. Now, obviously, we all know what happened in 2020. COVID came along, and you know, medical knowledge was being updated sort of on a weekly, if not daily, basis. And so it makes you wonder whether those traditional physical once-a-year conferences are still relevant. Because if we're saying that, you know, half-life of medical knowledge is 73 days, and then we have these that are once a year, is there scope, you know, whether it would be done online or through a social media platform or something of the sort, for there to be updates along the way? So yeah.
And on that point, April, putting you slightly on the spot there, but I think it's just fascinating to think about that half-life as an idea, and logically that's exactly what's happening. But the data I think you're referring to is, I think you said in 2017 or something, predicted 2020.
Absolutely.
Just out of interest, an obvious question is, has anybody looked at, you know, what the more up-to-date situation is? Have the original authors then gone back in 2020 and said, well, we were right or wrong?
That's a really brilliant question, because of course, if we're saying that medical knowledge has a half-life of 73 days, something back in 2017, you know, might slightly be out of date. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find something more regular. And definitely that would be very interesting to see how COVID changed that half-life. And, you know, and obviously with the new vaccines that came out and all the information that was coming out, it would be definitely very interesting to see.
And the logic is that we're now in 2023, So the half-life is even less. And you know, logic says actually, or I would say my sense is that's probably entirely true. And that's before you get into AI and actually discover that you can get an answer in a second, sort of thing. But you know, that the logic is there. It'd just be nice to see that someone's maybe somehow tracking it in some way and showing it. And I wanted to go back to your point about diversity. I mean, and there's again, there's a number of areas here which we could get really quite bogged down in. So we need to maybe be a little bit careful. But this is an area that I find interesting. You talked about the doctors who are having trouble to get to a meeting. Obviously, there's lots of them anyway. But importantly, the sort of the parts of the world which would traditionally have trouble sending people to a conference. Absolutely agree. Also, several questions in the chats about patients and so on. I mean, one of the great things that was supposed to happen over the last 3 or 4 years, as this all opened up, was not only those first 2 audiences, but the third audience was also supposed to get involved. You know, this is a magnificent opportunity to get patient and the patient voice into the conference room. And I'm not sure we're seeing that happening in reality. And I'm intrigued to go back to what Len was saying. And maybe Len, you've got a comment on this, because ESC as an example, you're quite familiar with. It was 2020, the first that was, I've got the right time. 2020 was the ESC in the middle of the pandemic, when they went completely virtual and completely free for everybody. And there was amazing numbers of people coming in. Huge numbers of people coming in and engaging, let alone registering, and lots of talk about how people coming in from parts of the world or communities that wouldn't normally get involved. And then I think it's gone a bit quiet. And I just wonder, Len, whether you've got an insight into what's happening now, because I'm not sure that lots of conference companies haven't gone, we need face-to-face. There's a lot of reasons we've touched on already why we're going to go back to face-to-face and how we're going to make it go back to face-to-face. And we're going to do that at the expense of those diverse audiences and patients and so on. Again, it might just be the case that we just don't know because they're not issuing the data. But Len, have you got an example? Because the ESC really seemed to be a trailblazer in that area at that time. But of course, that was only one conference that was free. And then afterwards, they tried to bring the money back in again, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, the number, I can't remember the actual increase in participants, but it was really quite huge.
It was that first one, yeah.
Yeah, and not only that, they published a paper in their online journal, and it was a very, very detailed analysis of the entire virtual event, how it was staged, huge amounts of detail. It was incredible. And they've been talking about the need for incorporating virtual events or virtual options for a long time. This is one of the things that started me on my journey into medical society conferences. But you know, they've, since the hybrid event last year, they haven't, at least for me as an outsider, maybe all this stuff is really available for members, but certainly not for me. I haven't heard anything at all. And I know they've made great strides in getting patients to participate. I mean, they've publicized a great deal, and I'm very aware of that. But what they're actually doing, I don't know, because they're just refusing to communicate. It's difficult to find out.
Again, we're speculating like crazy here. I mean, I can certainly say from, you know, very different sorts of organizations, I guess, but I'm a member of several professional organizations, for instance, who would have trumpeted 3-4 years ago how many people went to their conference in London or Paris or, you know, New York, whatever it was, who are really, really not giving much away to members, let alone anybody else, about what the real numbers are in that split between in the hybrid type situation. And I just assume and imagine and completely relate to what you're saying, that actually most of these societies aren't doing that because they're wrestling with what it means. I just think that's a real shame, because without knowing that, we don't know that sort of thing. But this point, we're not going to answer this question, but I find this like a fascinating question. You know, if you're running a hybrid conference, part of the point is to bring in people from those more difficult to reach communities and patients and so on. And I just don't see anybody providing any evidence of that. Well, so I don't know. Has anyone in the audience got any views on this? Sorry, and April, go on, April, go on.
Okay, and I just want to add to that, not just the remote and, you know, in terms of diversity, but also doctors in training, you know, are very important. Traditionally, the consultants, the head of departments, they get their expenses paid for to go to those conferences, but the doctors in training, the ones that are going to be in those positions who have, you know, a lot of interesting things to say about those topics don't actually get to go because of financing issues. And so it's about reining in sort of the entire, you know, having diversity in terms of not geographically, but in terms of, you know, position and
Everything.
ranking as well. Yeah, exactly.
It's just everything. And that was the wonderful sort of vision, you know, people like me get excited, you know, about the fact that we're opening up access to information. And I have to say, it seems to me that we're going backwards a little bit, you know, that go back to the old times because we like to get together again actually means going back to the old times of excluding a lot of the people that we wanted to include. And I just think it's a bit of a shame. I'm trying to keep my eyes on the comments coming in as well. If anyone in the audience has got any useful insights, it would be really interesting to hear from you. I just wanted to come, Ilan, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. I think it was Len who mentioned the questions that you put out about sustainability, whether doctors are interested, whether they want to see carbon offsetting and so on. Just talk a little bit from your point of view of what you've seen with that data. And again, maybe in April as well, just talk about what you think is behind the data and what's happening there. Because I think, again, there's an interesting conflict there between maybe what the audience wants and what other people are going to impose on them. But so Ilan, just explain a little bit, remind us what those figures are.
Overall, I think that data speaks for itself. You know, you can say that most of the physicians don't really care much about the footprint on the environment. On the other hand, it's I think it was more than 40%, so it's quite a big number, right? Len, was it 40%? I agree. You agree with
Yeah.
that?
50% don't care, basically.
50%.
50%, still a large number. On the other hand, the fact that they don't think that society should do something to offset it also tells you a story. But I would like to relate to, you know, one of the things that I know that Len is really concerned about is why societies are not sharing information. And I think maybe another symptom of it that you look at that is the fact that they are not really, maybe from obvious reasons, maybe from financial reasons, they don't really want to go into the side of the virtual hybrid. They prefer the physical setting, right? Because of all the different elements around it. And one of the things that you do see is that societies also don't help physicians to be engaged during the conference in a virtual manner in order to continue the discussion. Even if the physical setting is present, this is a physical conference, you don't see on websites of many societies the option to collaborate, to ask questions, to communicate, to have some kind of continuity over time and to be engaged with the speakers. And I think this is also part of the symptom. So not only on the virtual settings you don't see that, even in the physical one. And I think physicians really need that also to connect to what Dr. Chan just said, you know, for physicians in remote area, for physicians in developing countries, this is extremely important. So until societies will do that, to have that ability for physicians to connect after the conference, and maybe even during, it is left to social medias like GMED or maybe other platforms. But I think me and Len talked about it even before COVID. We were hoping that conferences will embrace that initiative to do that. They never did. So maybe just communities outside of the conferences can do that. And this is what GMED is doing right now.
I mean, arguably one of the positives is that even if we went full circle and everyone just went back to a face-to-face meeting again, the technology that can be put in place in that face-to-face meeting is now at a whole different level than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And I don't personally think that's the way it should go, but you know, the progress that's been made with technology solutions to allow engagement and so on was already happening quite quickly, but has accelerated at a rate of knots for the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah, so that's positive if it's then embraced and used. I just still come back to the basic practical problem that we'll never get back to a stage where everyone will go to face. So there's still a problem to wrestle with in terms of how to balance the interests of the virtual side of the audience and the physical side of the audience, however you frame that. And I just think if we don't know what's happening out there, we don't know what's happening out there. It'd be nice to get some more information from people, but I can see what people are wrestling with, and it sort of all comes back to money. April, we're going to start running out of time again in a minute if we're not careful. April, I just wanted to bring you in. I wanted to come back to that sort of carbon footprint type side of things. I just think it's interesting that there's in the last few years, I would argue we've seen a lot of organizations, companies, conferences, whatever, talking about sort of a bit, well, Len said, don't worry about coming to this conference because, you know, we'll plant some trees for you. Or companies going, we're doing the right thing because we're sending out people all around the world, but we always plant a tree when we go. I think that's tosh, greenwashing, it's whatever you want to call it. But it's interesting, it comes out of the little votes that you did, the little study you did, that the doctors are saying the medical society shouldn't sort of do that. Do you think that's because there's this cynicism about it? It's just, that's just tosh. And if so, what does that mean? Because there's the pressure on the organizer to show they're doing something, and it's an easy response to go, well, we'll plant a tree. Do you see what I'm getting at? I just, again, there's an interesting discussion in there.
Absolutely. So I think the answer is quite complex, but I think the original question was whether carbon emissions would influence your decision to go to a conference or not. And I think while doctors care about the environment, it may not necessarily influence their actions. I'm not speaking on behalf of all the doctors, but you know, I wonder if there's just a little bit of discrepancy there. And second of all, I think if the second question was whether they want the medical societies to offset the carbon footprint. And I wonder if, you know, many of them replied no, because there was sort of a worry whether that would account to additional financial costs, or there were additional consequences in order to do that offsetting. So maybe perhaps the message is just not clear, or I'm not sure, but I think it could be clarified, and you know, perhaps there is an element of just education there. Okay.
I'm just very cynical as to whether it does any good, and it just depends on whether I've got any money. So if I'm rich enough to fly to Japan a couple of times a year, you know, and take my family over there or something like that, I'm probably rich enough to add a little bit of money in to plant a few trees, and then go on Facebook and tell my friends that I'm doing the right thing because I'm planting trees. But actually, so what, you're flying to Japan and back for a holiday, you know, it's just there's an entitlement in there, and there's a sort of, and it's a sort of them and us. If you can afford to plant a tree, then you're okay, and if you can't, you can't. And I think there's a cynicism around that. I'm certainly very cynical about that. When I see companies saying that's what we do to solve the problem, it's a much more complex problem looking at your carbon footprint, in my opinion, sort of thing. But I just we are going to run out of time, aren't we? I hate running out of time. A couple of quick questions. Let's throw a couple of quick questions at you. And I think, Ilan, you're answering question there. Just if you were answering that question, sorry, several questions came in about those 400 odd people that answered the question about whether they wanted to be there in person or virtual. Do you know any sort of sense of the breakdown around the world and so on? Do you have it just off the top of your head? Have you got any more data you can share?
So I just wrote that on the chat. So those are 49 countries. It's quite a lot. By the way, the previous survey we had more than 1,200 people answering, and again, at least this number of countries. So we didn't analyze it yet. We're happy to analyze it and tell you what's the difference per country, but basically it gives you a good idea. Those countries had good presence of the West and other countries as well. So that's the overall.
Okay, we had a question early on about the value of CME versus non-CME events. That's a whole webinar in itself, but April, just give us a sense from your point of view as a practicing physician, you know, value of CME versus non-CME, just to finish us off.
I think it is important. I mean, it's definitely a tick box exercise that unfortunately a lot of physicians does have to take at the end of the day. And so, yeah, it is important.
You think you would basically be on the side of it does make a difference if there's CME accreditation in order to attract people to an event. Yeah, okay. That's, as I say, there's a whole debate in there. Probably we could talk again at a different time. We are a bit over time. I think we've covered off some interesting ground there. And I think there will probably just be an ongoing, if we were in real life, we'd just be having an argument now over coffee or a drink or something about the value of face-to-face versus virtual versus, in my opinion, the economics of the thing, and whether it's realistic to be able to keep everybody happy all the time. But absolutely fascinating. As always, we don't have enough time. As always, it's just fascinating listening to you talk. As always, I'm hoping we're giving people food for thought. As always, I love the fact the audience has been pitching in with their comments, which we're looking at. But we have run out of time. So can I draw a line to that? Say a huge thank you to the panelists who joined in there, and you know, from Israel, from Germany, me sitting here in Oxford. I love the fact we can get this sort of group together in this way. Thank you to the audience for coming in from all over the world again and sharing your thoughts. Part of the point of these webinars is you make connections with each other. I'll certainly say for the panelists, you're very happy, I know, for people to reach out to you, and LinkedIn is a very easy way of doing it. So please, guys, do take the opportunity to follow up these conversations. I'll say if I can help, or if anyone's interested in what I do, medcomsnetworking.com will reach out to me. Always hashtag medcoms. You know, keep the conversation going online, guys. And on that point, I will stop the recording and just ask the panelists to say goodbye. Bye bye, everybody. Take care.